Few men in history have been celebrated as visionaries during their lifetimes, only to be judged by posterity as architects of catastrophe. Thomas Midgley, Jr. is one of those men. A mechanical engineer and chemist, born in America's industrial heartland, he was once hailed as a savior of modern technology. His inventions promised miracles: smoother running cars, safer refrigerators, more comfortable homes. Newspapers praised him, corporations enriched him, and fellow scientists admired his relentless ingenuity. Yet the very solutions he designed to solve the problems of his age planted the seeds of global disasters. Midgley was the father of two infamous substances: tetraethyl lead, which poisoned generations through leaded gasoline, and chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which tore holes in the ozone layer protecting Earth. His work reshaped human life in the 20th century, but at an unfathomable cost to public health and the planet. The short-term brilliance of his discoveries blinded society to their long-term dangers. Today, historians and environmental scientists alike rank him among the most destructive inventors in human history. And yet, the story of Thomas Midgley, Jr. is not simply one of villainy. It is the story of a curious boy who grew into a determined engineer, who lived in a time when progress was worshipped and when the consequences of innovation were rarely questioned. It is the story of ambition, industrial might, scientific triumph, and tragic blindness. His life was a warning dressed as success, a narrative that forces us to ask whether intelligence without foresight is a blessing or a curse. The world into which Thomas Midgley, Jr. was born in 1889 was pulsing with change. America was racing into the modern era, its factories roaring, its cities expanding, and its people dreaming of invention. The railroad stitched the country together, steel skyscrapers began to pierce the skies, and the hum of machinery echoed in every industrial town. Electricity was spreading, automobiles were appearing on dusty streets, and a new century of mechanical marvels was at hand. In this world, the engineer was king. Society craved solutions to problems that earlier generations had not even imagined: how to power cities, how to build faster machines, how to light homes without fire, how to move people across continents in hours rather than weeks. America was a laboratory of progress, and young minds eager to tinker found endless opportunity. Thomas Midgley, Jr. was born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, into a family with inventive blood. His father, Thomas Midgley, Sr., was an accomplished inventor in his own right, known for designing rubber goods and mechanical devices. His mother, Hattie Emerson Midgley, came from a respected New England family. Together they gave their son a home where curiosity was not only accepted but encouraged. It was a household filled with talk of gears, patents, and ideas. When Thomas was still a boy, the family moved to Columbus, Ohio, a growing city that embodied the restless energy of the age. Columbus was home to factories, workshops, and Ohio State University, which lent the city an air of academic seriousness. It was here that Midgley grew up, and where he first became fascinated with machines and chemistry. Like many boys of his generation, he built gadgets from scraps, experimented with small engines, and devoured any book he could find on science. But Midgley's interests were not narrow. He was as captivated by the workings of plants as by pistons. As a child, he was known to study the colors of autumn leaves, not merely for their beauty, but to understand the chemical secrets behind them. That curiosity would later resurface in his professional work when he used dyes to trace chemical reactions. Even in his early years, he displayed the hallmarks of a man who refused to see boundaries between disciplines. By the time Midgley reached his teenage years, the automobile was beginning to revolutionize American life. The Durea brothers had built the first successful gasoline car in the 1,890 seconds, and by the early 1,900 seconds, Henry Ford was preparing to launch the Model T. Roads that had once been the domain of horses and wagons were now crowded with sputtering, noisy machines. But these cars were fragile, temperamental, and often dangerous. They broke down easily, struggled to climb hills, and above all, their engines knocked violently when fuel combusted unevenly. The problem of engine knock would become the central puzzle of Midgley's career. In 1905, when Thomas was 16, he enrolled at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Cornell was one of the finest engineering schools in the nation, and it exposed him to the cutting edge of science. He studied mechanical engineering, a discipline that demanded both mathematical precision and inventive imagination. His professors stressed practical problem-solving, designing engines, understanding thermodynamics, and applying chemistry to industry. Cornell gave him the tools, but his restless mind provided the drive. Outside of class, Midgley was known as friendly, energetic, and relentlessly curious. He played baseball, enjoyed outdoor activities, and built close friendships. But what distinguished him most was his ability to look at technical problems with a craftsman's eye. He did not simply accept what textbooks said. He wanted to test, to measure, to see for himself. This blend of hands-on skill and theoretical knowledge would later allow him to tackle some of the most stubborn problems facing industry. When Midgley graduated in 1911, America was in the midst of a technological boom. Automobiles were multiplying, airplanes were beginning to fly longer distances, and industry demanded constant innovation. For a young engineer with ambition, the opportunities seemed limitless. Midgley returned briefly to Ohio, where he applied his skills in small industrial projects. But soon, his path would cross with one of the most important figures in American engineering, Charles F. Kettering, the legendary inventor and head of research at General Motors. This meeting would change the course of Midgley's life. Under Kettering's mentorship, he would have the freedom to explore, experiment, and invent. The boy who once studied autumn leaves would soon be testing chemical additives for gasoline, chasing solutions to engine knock, and stumbling upon discoveries that would alter the world. Yet behind the promise of progress lurked dangers invisible to his generation. The America of 1911 celebrated invention without asking too many questions about safety or environment. What mattered was growth, speed, and dominance. Midgley entered this world with enthusiasm, and he would soon deliver inventions that embodied the optimism and the blindness of his age. If the industrial world of late 19th century America set the stage for Thomas Midgley Jr.'s life, it was his own restless curiosity that provided the spark. Even as a child, Midgley possessed an instinct to peer beneath the surface of things. Where other boys saw a leaf fall from a tree and trampled it underfoot, he picked it up, examined its patterns, and wondered why its veins carried red or yellow instead of green. Where some tinkered with toys, he dismantled clocks, bicycles, and household tools, determined to understand their secret workings. This appetite for discovery was not unusual in an age obsessed with invention, but Midgley carried it with a quiet intensity. His father, an inventor of rubber devices, exposed him early to the excitement of patents and prototypes. He learned that an idea scribbled on paper could be transformed into a product used by thousands. In the Midgley household, invention was not distant heroism, it was dinner-table conversation. Columbus, Ohio, where the family settled, provided an environment that fed these impulses. The city was buzzing with industrial growth, its workshops and factories spilling smoke into the sky. At the same time, Ohio State University and its libraries provided access to science and literature. The boy grew up in a place where industry and intellect intertwined steel and soot on one side, scholarship on the other. By his teenage years, Midgley had begun to cultivate not just curiosity, but discipline. He was not content with idle speculation, he wanted proof. In his notebooks, he sketched designs for machines, recorded chemical observations, and sometimes combined the two in small experiments. Family anecdotes recall him using dyes to trace the flow of fluids, a primitive method that foreshadowed his later habit of visualizing chemical processes with striking simplicity. It was little surprise, then, that when the time came to choose a path, he enrolled at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Cornell in the early 20th century was one of America's great technical institutions. Its laboratories bristled with new equipment, and its faculty were men on the frontier of engineering science. Cornell attracted ambitious young men who wanted to be not merely workers in factories, but creators of the machines that would shape the future. For Midgley, the transition from Columbus to Ithaca was transformative. Cornell sat on the hills overlooking Cayuga Lake, a place of both natural beauty and intellectual rigor. There, the young Midgley immersed himself in mechanical engineering. The curriculum demanded long hours of study, courses in thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, metallurgy, and applied chemistry. Professors drilled their students not only in theory, but in practical application. In the machine shops, students forged, filed, and assembled their own devices, learning that an elegant equation meant little unless it could be hammered into iron and steel. Midgley thrived in this environment. His mind was nimble, able to leap from the precision of mathematics to the intuition of experiment. He was not the most brilliant theoretician, but he had a gift more useful in industry, the ability to see problems in practical terms and to improvise solutions. He learned to look at an engine and sense what it lacked, to observe a flame and imagine how its combustion might be controlled. His professors noted his eagerness, his willingness to test limits, and his refusal to accept a problem as unsolvable. Outside the classroom, Midgley was sociable and active. He played baseball, enjoyed long walks, and cultivated friendships with fellow students. But even in leisure, he carried the mind of an engineer. Teammates remembered him sketching mechanical diagrams between innings, explaining to anyone who would listen why certain materials failed or why some fuels burned hotter than others. He was not aloof, but he carried an intensity that revealed itself in unexpected ways. The intellectual climate of Cornell at the time also shaped his worldview. America was entering an era of technological optimism. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk less than a decade earlier. Henry Ford was about to revolutionize industry with the moving assembly line. Thomas Edison was still alive, his name synonymous with invention. The prevailing belief was that technology could solve nearly any problem. Engineers were not merely workers, they were the high priests of progress, guiding humanity into a brighter future. This faith in technology became part of Midgley's DNA. He absorbed the ethos that invention was inherently good, that problems existed to be solved by cleverness, and that the consequences of innovation would inevitably be positive. The notion that a discovery might unleash hidden dangers was rarely considered. The industrial world wanted solutions, not cautions. When he graduated in 1911, degree in hand, he entered a society eager to put men like him to work. America was expanding its automobile industry at breakneck speed. Factories churned out cars by the thousands, yet those cars were noisy, fragile, and plagued by mechanical issues. The most troubling of these was the mysterious engine knock, a violent pinging sound caused by premature combustion inside the cylinders. Engineers knew it robbed engines of power, damaged parts, and frightened customers, but no one knew how to stop it. For a young man like Midgley, this was not just a problem, it was an invitation. Engine knock was the kind of riddle that appealed to both his curiosity and his ambition. Soon, under the mentorship of Charles F. Kettering, one of the most respected inventors of the age, Midgley would take up the challenge. His search for a solution would lead to a chemical breakthrough that made him rich and famous, even as it set the world on a path toward silent poisoning. At Cornell, Midgley had trained his hands and sharpened his mind. Now, in the industrial laboratories of America, he would unleash that training on problems of global consequence. He left Ithaca not just as an engineer, but as a man ready to reshape modern life, and in ways he could never have imagined, to scar it. When Thomas Midgley Jr. left Cornell in 1911, diploma in hand, he stepped into a world hungry for engineers. America was on the cusp of a mechanical age, and the automobile stood at the center of it. What had once been a luxury curiosity for the wealthy was rapidly becoming the defining machine of the century. Yet, in 1911, the car was still crude, unreliable, and temperamental. Roads were poor, engines misfired constantly, and drivers spent more time repairing their vehicles than enjoying them. For a young mechanical engineer with ambition, this was fertile ground. Midgley returned to Ohio and found his way into small industrial jobs, applying his skills where he could. But his career truly began to take shape in 1916 when he came under the wing of one of the most brilliant inventors in America, Charles F. Kettering. Kettering, already famous for inventing the electric self-starter for cars, was a legend in the engineering world. Before his invention, cars had to be cranked by hand, a dangerous and often humiliating task. With the push of a button, Kettering had transformed the automobile into a practical machine for everyday use, especially for women who were largely excluded from driving in the crank era. By the time Midgley met him, Kettering was head of research at the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, better known as Delco, which would soon be absorbed into General Motors. Kettering was not only brilliant, he was a natural leader of men. He believed in giving his researchers freedom to explore, to make mistakes, and to chase unconventional ideas. Where other managers imposed rigid hierarchies, Kettering fostered creativity. For a restless and inventive mind like Midgley's, this was the perfect environment. At Delco, Midgley was tasked with studying the chemistry of fuels. Automobiles were spreading across America, but their engines were plagued by the dreaded knock. Drivers would hear it as a sharp metallic ping, a sound that not only irritated but damaged engines over time. Engineers and chemists alike were baffled by the phenomenon. They understood it had to do with the premature detonation of fuel, but no one knew how to stop it. The problem was so serious that some feared it might limit the future of the automobile itself. Midgley threw himself into the problem with characteristic intensity. He was not content simply to theorize. He designed experiments, rigging up test engines, adding chemicals to gasoline, and recording results with painstaking care. It was here that his unusual blend of mechanical skill and chemical curiosity bore fruit. Most engineers of the era saw engines as mechanical puzzles, while most chemists treated fuels as purely chemical. Midgley straddled both worlds, a hybrid thinker who could tinker with carburetors in the morning and mix additives in the afternoon. The work was grueling, and the failures were constant. He tested hundreds of substances, from iodine to camphor to aniline, searching for anything that would smooth combustion. Some additives worked briefly but corroded engines. Others failed outright. Still, Midgley persisted. Kettering encouraged him, reminding him that invention was always a process of trial and error. It was during these years that Midgley began to display one of his defining traits, an almost theatrical confidence in his ideas. He did not merely experiment, he believed, with a salesman's charm, that he could convince others of his discoveries. Later, this would serve him well and disastrously when promoting substances whose dangers were not yet understood. By 1920, Midgley had become a trusted lieutenant in Kettering's laboratory. His relentless pursuit of solutions impressed his colleagues, and his experiments were growing more daring. He was convinced that the answer to engine knock lay not in redesigning engines, but in modifying the fuel itself. If gasoline could be coaxed to burn more evenly, the problem might be solved without overhauling the machines. It was a radical approach for its time, but Midgley believed in it. That same year, General Motors acquired Delco and placed Kettering in charge of its entire research division. Midgley was swept along in the transition, suddenly positioned at the heart of one of the most powerful corporations in America. He was still relatively young, barely in his 30s, but he was now working on problems that could shape the future of the automobile industry. The stage was set for his first great invention, one that would make him famous, earn him fortunes, and though he could not know it yet, poison the world. In the coming years, Thomas Midgley, Jr. would discover tetraethyl lead, the additive that silenced engine knock but spread toxic metal into the air of every city on Earth. But in 1916, as he walked through the laboratories of Dayton, he was simply a young engineer with a burning curiosity, guided by a brilliant mentor, and driven by the belief that every problem had a solution if only one looked hard enough. It was optimism born of his age, and it would soon collide with the darker truths of chemistry. By the late 1910 seconds, the automobile was no longer a novelty, it was becoming a necessity. Farmers used trucks to move crops, cities buzzed with motor cars, and America's love affair with the road was beginning. But beneath the glamour of progress lay a stubborn and dangerous flaw: the rattle and clang of engine knock. To the average driver, knock was a nuisance, a sharp metallic ping echoing from the engine like a hammer striking steel. To engineers, it was something far worse, a destructive force eating away at the very heart of combustion engines. It robbed power, reduced efficiency, and shattered pistons. Engines that should have lasted years sometimes failed within months. In an age when the car industry was still fragile, this was not a minor irritation, it was an existential threat. For years, scientists puzzled over the cause. They understood that gasoline was a volatile mixture of hydrocarbons, prone to uneven burning. In theory, fuel was supposed to ignite in a smooth wave as the piston compressed it, but in practice, the fuel often detonated prematurely, setting off a violent shock wave that produced the dreaded knock. Worse, the problem grew more severe as engines became more powerful. The automobile industry could not move forward until it was solved. Charles Kettering, always looking ahead, recognized the urgency. He believed the answer lay not in redesigning engines, an expensive and complicated prospect, but in altering the fuel itself. If gasoline could be modified to burn in a controlled manner, the engine would run quietly, efficiently, and powerfully. It was a bold idea, one that demanded both chemical insight and mechanical ingenuity. This was precisely the kind of challenge that suited Thomas Midgley, Jr. His training in mechanical engineering gave him an intimate understanding of the engine's workings, while his fascination with chemistry allowed him to think beyond pistons and valves. To Midgley, the problem of knock was not merely mechanical, it was molecular. Somewhere in the chemistry of combustion lay a key, waiting to be discovered. In the laboratory at Dayton, Midgley and his colleagues embarked on a campaign of relentless experimentation. They added one chemical after another to gasoline, each time running tests, recording results, and observing whether the knock diminished. They tried iodine, bromine, sulfur, selenium, camphor, aniline, tin, and countless other compounds. Some quieted the knock briefly but corroded engine parts. Others had no effect at all. Each failure added to the frustration but also to Midgley's determination. His approach was both systematic and intuitive. He kept careful records, noting not just whether knock decreased, but how the engine sounded, how the exhaust looked, and how the parts wore down. At the same time, he trusted his instincts, often reaching for substances that seemed unlikely, guided by little more than a hunch. He once remarked that the only way to solve such a problem was to try everything until something worked, and so he did. By 1919, the search was exhausting the patience of some at General Motors. Hundreds of additives had been tested with little to show for it. Kettering, however, refused to give up. He trusted Midgley's persistence. He gave his young protégé freedom, resources, and encouragement. In Kettering's eyes, invention was not a straight line, but a winding path, and Midgley had the temperament to follow it. The experiments took a toll. Day after day, Midgley and his assistants inhaled fumes of strange chemicals, their lungs burning, their skin irritated. Safety precautions were minimal, as was common in laboratories of the era. To them, the danger seemed trivial compared to the importance of the task. The world wanted better engines. They would deliver them. Then, in December 1921, after more than 2 years of fruitless searching, Midgley stumbled upon a breakthrough. Testing a series of organometallic compounds, he added a small quantity of tetraethyl lead, TEL, to gasoline. To his astonishment, the engine ran smoothly. The knock that had haunted engineers for years was gone, silenced by a chemical that seemed almost magical in its effectiveness. The discovery electrified the lab. Here, at last, was a substance that worked not just temporarily, not with side effects too severe to bear, but with stunning efficiency. Just a few drops per gallon transformed gasoline into a miracle fuel. For Midgley, it was a moment of triumph, the kind of eureka moment scientists dream of. Yet even as he celebrated, a shadow lingered. Tetraethyl lead was not a harmless chemical. It was a powerful neurotoxin, long known in medical literature for its dangers. Doctors had written of lead palsy, hallucinations, madness, and death caused by exposure to lead. Alchemists of old had feared it, miners had suffered from it, and workers in the plumbing trades had been poisoned by it. But in the laboratories of Dayton, those warnings seemed distant, overshadowed by the dazzling promise of progress. Midgley and Kettering saw in TEL not a hazard but a solution. They christened it with a respectable name, ethyl, and prepared to unleash it upon the world. What they did not realize, or perhaps chose not to confront, was that this triumph carried within it a catastrophe that would echo across generations. The problem of engine knock had been solved, but in solving it, Thomas Midgley, Jr. had unwittingly opened the door to one of the greatest environmental disasters in human history. The winter of 1921 marked a turning point not only in Thomas Midgley, Jr.'s career, but in the history of modern industry. After hundreds of failed experiments, after months of inhaling noxious fumes and enduring the discouragement of colleagues, Midgley had found the additive that silenced engine knock. With just 1 part tetraethyl lead to 1,000 parts gasoline, the problem that had haunted engineers for decades vanished. The discovery spread quickly through the laboratories of General Motors. Charles Kettering, ever the visionary, immediately grasped its significance. If cars could run more smoothly and powerfully without knocking, they would not only last longer but also attract more customers. Automobiles were already transforming American life, but this breakthrough promised to make them indispensable. To Kettering, it was more than chemistry. It was the key to industrial dominance. Midgley himself was jubilant. He had not only solved a technical puzzle, but done so with elegance. TEL worked at tiny concentrations, required no redesign of engines, and seemed to offer a universal fix. For a man who prided himself on practical genius, it was the ultimate triumph. In his notes, he described the fuel as if it were a kind of alchemy, a magic potion capable of taming steel beasts. But there was one problem. The name, tetraethyl lead, sounded ominous, cold, and toxic. Even to lay ears it carried the whisper of danger. General Motors, keen to market its discovery to the public, sought a softer label. They chose simply ethyl, no mention of lead, no hint of poison, just a clean, almost feminine word that suggested refinement and trust. Thus, ethyl gasoline was born, a product destined to fuel millions of cars and poison countless lives. In 1923, GM, in partnership with DuPont and Standard Oil of New Jersey, created the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation to manufacture and distribute the new fuel. The companies moved swiftly, eager to outpace rivals and secure profits. Refineries were built, factories retooled, and advertising campaigns launched. Posters showed happy families driving quietly down smooth roads, thanks to the miracle of ethyl. Engineers proclaimed the dawn of a new era in motoring. Yet behind the glossy promises, the dangers were already showing. The men who worked with tetraethyl lead in laboratories and factories began to fall ill. They complained of dizziness, fatigue, and hallucinations. Some became violent, others incoherent. In one DuPont plant in New Jersey, workers developed a condition they called loony gas, staggering and muttering nonsense before collapsing. Within months, several were dead. Midgley himself was not immune. During experiments, he had inhaled so much lead vapor that he fell gravely sick, his body weakened, his mind clouded. He retreated to Florida to recover, soaking in the sun and salt air until his strength returned. Yet, astonishingly, he never abandoned his conviction that TEL was safe when handled properly. Later, at press conferences, he would theatrically wash his hands in tetraethyl lead and inhale its vapors, smiling as if to banish public fears. The performance was convincing, but it was a deadly illusion. The companies dismissed early deaths as accidents of poor handling, insisting that with proper precautions, ethyl was safe. The profits were too large, the demand too strong, and the technology too revolutionary to pause. By the mid-1920 seconds, service stations across America proudly advertised ethyl gasoline. Drivers noticed the difference immediately: smoother rides, more power, less noise. The miracle was real, even if its price was hidden. Scientists outside the corporate walls raised alarms. Public health experts warned that lead was a cumulative poison, invisible yet insidious, capable of damaging the brain, the nervous system, and the lungs. Children were especially vulnerable, their growing bodies absorbing lead with devastating consequences. But in an era when industrial power spoke louder than medical caution, such voices were drowned out. For Midgley, the years following his discovery were a period of recognition and acclaim. In 1923, he received the prestigious Nichols Medal from the American Chemical Society. Newspapers hailed him as a brilliant problem solver, the man who had silenced the knock of engines and helped secure the future of the automobile. He basked in the glory, never doubting or never admitting that his invention carried a darker truth. If he had died in 1923, history might have remembered Thomas Midgley, Jr. as nothing more than a clever engineer who gave the world smoother engines. But he lived on, and his story deepened. He would go on to invent another miracle chemical, just as transformative, just as celebrated, and just as catastrophic. The tale of ethyl was far from over. As millions of cars roared to life with leaded gasoline, as city air filled with invisible particles of poison, the stage was being set for a global health disaster that would take nearly a century to undo. Midgley's triumph was complete, and so too was his fatal mistake. By the mid-1920 seconds, America was humming with the sound of engines. From bustling city streets to dusty country roads, automobiles were no longer luxuries, but necessities. And increasingly, those automobiles were running on ethyl gasoline, the so-called miracle fuel born from Thomas Midgley, Jr.'s discovery. Service stations proudly displayed the orange ethyl sign, promising drivers smoother rides and more powerful engines. Newspapers hailed it as a triumph of American ingenuity. Advertisements depicted families smiling in shiny cars, their journeys untroubled by mechanical rattles. To the public, ethyl was progress made tangible, bottled in every gallon. Inside General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont, the mood was triumphant. The Ethyl Gasoline Corporation, founded in 1923, was thriving. Profits soared, patents secured monopolies. Kettering and Midgley were celebrated as heroes of invention, men who had conquered one of the automobile industry's most stubborn problems. In corporate boardrooms, Ethel was not just a product, it was a symbol of dominance. Yet, as champagne glasses clinked in celebration, a darker story was unfolding in the shadows. The workers who produced tetrathyl lead, the key ingredient in Ethel, were paying a terrible price. At the Bayway refinery in New Jersey, owned by Standard Oil, men tasked with handling TEL began to exhibit strange symptoms. They staggered, muttered incoherently, and suffered violent convulsions. Some clawed at the air as if fending off invisible attackers. Locals called it the curse of the loony gas. In just 1 year, more than 30 workers were hospitalized and at least 5 died in horrifying conditions. The incidents drew headlines. Newspapers reported gasoline that drives men mad, describing delirious workers who screamed of insects crawling over their skin. Public health officials raised alarms, pointing out that lead had long been known as a deadly poison. The U.S. Public Health Service began inquiries. Critics demanded to know whether a fuel that killed factory workers could truly be safe for millions of motorists breathing its fumes on city streets. Midgley, by then a rising star, was summoned to defend the invention. With characteristic flair, he staged public demonstrations to reassure skeptics. At one press event, he poured tetraethyl lead over his hands, then lifted a flask to his nose and inhaled deeply, declaring he could do so day after day without harm. It was theater, a bold performance designed to silence doubt. What he did not mention was that he himself had already suffered from lead poisoning and had been forced to take a long convalescence in Florida to recover. The corporations joined the chorus of reassurance. Ethel Gasoline Corporation insisted that the incidents at Bayway were isolated, the result of inadequate safety protocols, not the additive itself. They argued that TEL, when properly blended into gasoline, posed no risk to the public. Their lobbyists pressured officials, their lawyers managed inquiries, and their advertisements drowned out dissent. For a time, the strategy worked. The U.S. Surgeon General convened a conference in 1925 to investigate the health effects of leaded gasoline. Scientists warned of long-term dangers, particularly to children, but the panel, influenced by industry arguments and lacking definitive long-term studies, concluded there was no reason to ban ethyl. The government allowed production to continue, though under controlled conditions. The celebration resumed. Sales climbed. By the late 1922, leaded gasoline was being pumped into cars across America and soon across the world. Millions inhaled its invisible particles, unaware that each breath carried a trace of poison. The silence around its dangers grew louder than the voices of critics. For Midgley, these years were golden. He basked in honors and enjoyed the privileges of success. He was invited to conferences, toasted by industry leaders, and hailed in magazines as a man who had improved daily life. His family prospered, his reputation soared, and his confidence in the benevolence of invention only deepened. But beneath the surface, the truth was festering. Scientists outside corporate circles continued to warn of lead's cumulative effects. Reports surfaced of children in cities showing developmental delays, of rising cases of lead poisoning in neighborhoods near refineries. The evidence was fragmented, but the pattern was unmistakable. Still, the silence prevailed. Industry power, public desire for progress, and the absence of immediate catastrophe combined to bury the warnings. Society, eager for smoother rides and faster cars, looked away. The celebration of ethyl gasoline was complete. The silence about its dangers was deafening, and Thomas Midgley, Jr., smiling for cameras, stood at the center of both, celebrated as a genius, even as the seeds of catastrophe spread quietly into the air. By the end of the 1,920 seconds, leaded gasoline was everywhere. From Detroit to New York, from Chicago to Los Angeles, the hiss and hum of engines filled the air with an invisible dust particles of lead oxide spewed from exhaust pipes, settling on streets, drifting into homes, and lodging themselves in human lungs. Drivers didn't notice. Passersby didn't notice. Even the scientists studying air quality struggled to detect the poison, but it was there, accumulating quietly, leaving its mark on the bodies of millions. The most immediate victims were the workers who manufactured tetraethyl lead. In the refineries and blending plants, men handled the chemical with little protection. Gloves were scarce, ventilation poor, and masks non-existent. The result was a grim toll of illness and death. At DuPont's Deepwater plant in New Jersey, workers assigned to the loony gas rooms frequently collapsed after only a few weeks on the job. Some clawed at their heads as if insects burrowed beneath their skin. Others screamed at phantoms, hallucinating wild animals or invisible enemies. One man tried to strangle his coworker, convinced he was under attack. Another leapt from a window to escape visions no one else could see. Doctors recognized the symptoms immediately. Acute lead poisoning, a condition as old as Roman plumbing, now resurrected in modern industry. By 1925, at least dozens of workers were dead and hundreds more incapacitated. Newspapers called the Bayway Refinery the House of Butterflies, named for the hallucinations that plagued dying men. Public outrage flared briefly, but industry spokesmen dismissed the deaths as rare mishaps. They blamed improper handling, insisting that under proper safety measures, TEL was harmless. With the government hesitant to challenge industrial giants, production continued. The danger did not stop at factory walls. Beyond the gates, in neighborhoods near refineries, doctors began noticing children with strange ailments, developmental delays, seizures, unexplained weakness. Physicians suspected lead exposure, but struggled to prove it. The science of environmental toxicity was still in its infancy, and no one yet had the tools to measure the subtle accumulation of lead in blood and bone. What no one realized was that every gallon of ethyl burned released a fine mist of lead into the atmosphere. Once in the air, it settled on playgrounds, gardens, and water supplies. In urban centers, children absorbed it at alarming rates, their young bodies more vulnerable than adults. The effects were not immediate or dramatic. They were insidious, creeping silently into minds and bodies. Lower IQ, shortened attention spans, increased impulsivity, the symptoms were invisible at first, but devastating in the long run. Later generations of scientists would draw the connections with chilling clarity. They would discover that leaded gasoline contributed to a global epidemic of lead poisoning, affecting cognitive development in untold millions of children. They would trace rising crime rates in the late 20th century, partly to the neurological effects of lead exposure. They would estimate that leaded fuel shortened lifespans, reduced productivity, and inflicted a social cost measured in trillions of dollars. But in the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, such truths were buried beneath the triumph of progress. Ethyl gasoline was too profitable, too successful, and too beloved to challenge. Drivers marveled at their quieter engines. Oil companies counted their profits. Engineers applauded the innovation. And the victims, workers driven mad, children quietly poisoned, families living in the shadow of refineries were dismissed as statistical noise. Thomas Midgley, Jr., meanwhile, remained the public face of ethyl. In interviews and conferences, he radiated confidence. He admitted no doubt, showed no hesitation, whether he truly believed TEL was safe or simply convinced himself it was worth the risk, history cannot say. What is certain is that his calm reassurances helped maintain the silence. He was both inventor and salesman, a man who could wave away fears with a smile. And so the hidden toll mounted. year after year, invisible yet relentless. By the time society realized the full cost of leaded gasoline, the damage would already be done. Generations would inherit the burden of a decision made in the name of progress. Midgley's invention had silenced the knock of engines, but it had unleashed a far more destructive noise, a quiet, deadly hum inside the bodies of millions. The hidden toll had begun, and it would echo through the century. By the 1932nd, America had become a nation in motion. The automobile was no longer a novelty or a luxury. It was a symbol of freedom, progress, and identity. Families piled into cars for Sunday drives. Workers commuted to factories and offices in their own vehicles. Roads stretched farther and smoother than ever before, knitting the country into a web of mobility. And in the tank of nearly every car was leaded gasoline ethyl, the miracle fuel that had silenced the rattle of engines. The triumph was absolute. Ethyl was now sold nationwide, and foreign markets were opening as well. Europe embraced it, Asia followed, and soon the entire industrialized world was running on fuel laced with lead. It was, on the surface, one of the great success stories of modern engineering. But beneath that surface, a silent contamination was spreading. Every gallon of gasoline burned, released microscopic particles of lead into the air. Exhaust pipes spewed them into neighborhoods, schoolyards, and parks. The dust settled on vegetables in gardens, seeped into reservoirs, and clung to the walls of homes. Invisible, tasteless, and odorless, it entered human bodies with every breath, every sip of water, every bite of food. Lead does not decay or dissolve. Once released, it lingers. And once inside the body, it never leaves entirely. Doctors had long known that lead was a poison. Ancient Romans had suffered from lead pipes and cookware, and medical journals of the 19th century described lead palsy and saturnine gout. But those cases involved acute exposure miners, smelters, or painters who handled heavy amounts of lead. The subtle, widespread, low-level exposure from gasoline exhaust was harder to detect. The symptoms, fatigue, irritability, cognitive delays in children could be mistaken for countless other ailments, and so the poisoning of a nation proceeded quietly, almost invisibly. By the late 1932nd, children in urban centers were showing alarming patterns. Pediatricians noticed more cases of developmental delays, unexplained seizures, and behavioral problems. Researchers in Baltimore, New York, and Cleveland began linking these conditions to elevated lead levels. Some even traced the contamination to dust near busy roads and refineries. But their warnings were brushed aside. Industry-funded scientists argued that the evidence was inconclusive, that more studies were needed, that no proof of harm existed in normal exposure. Meanwhile, General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont continued to reap profits. The Ethyl Gasoline Corporation maintained a robust publicity campaign emphasizing the benefits of the product and downplaying concerns. They funded research that conveniently showed no significant danger. They pressured regulators to remain cautious but not prohibitive, and they found allies in a government eager to promote industrial growth during the Great Depression and the build-up to World War II. Even Thomas Midgley, Jr., who had suffered his own bout of lead poisoning in the early 1922, insisted publicly on the safety of ethyl. He appeared calm, articulate, reassuring, a man of science defending his work. His demonstrations, his words, his very presence helped maintain public trust. For him, perhaps, it was not simply about profit or reputation. It was about belief. He had solved a great technical problem. He could not allow himself to see that he had created a greater human one. The result was a paradox. Never before had so many people been exposed to a neurotoxin, and never before had so few recognized it. Lead entered the bloodstreams of entire populations, subtly reshaping intelligence, behavior, and health. It dulled minds, shortened tempers, and weakened bodies. It left fingerprints on the very fabric of society. Later, researchers would argue that the removal of lead from gasoline in the late 20th century corresponded with dramatic drops in crime rates, a chilling reminder of how deeply it had penetrated human life. But in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, these connections were invisible. Progress drowned out caution. Cars rolled off assembly lines, gas stations multiplied, and Ethel's profits soared. To question leaded gasoline was to question the very engine of modernity. Few dared. And so, as America drove forward, the invisible toll mounted. The blood of a nation carried traces of Thomas Midgley Jr.'s invention. Mothers unknowingly passed lead to their unborn children. Children absorbed it in their bones. Adults carried it in their veins. A chemical solution to a mechanical problem had, quietly and irrevocably, become a public health catastrophe. As the 1,930 seconds dawned, Thomas Midgley Jr. was already celebrated as a man who had conquered one of the great mechanical demons of his age. Leaded gasoline had secured his reputation, won him medals, and filled the coffers of General Motors and its partners. Yet Midgley was not finished. The restless energy that had driven him to solve the problem of engine knock pushed him onward toward new challenges. One of the most pressing problems of the era was not on the highways, but in the home: refrigeration. At the start of the 20th century, keeping food fresh was still a daily struggle. Ice boxes filled with blocks of ice delivered by wagon were the norm in most households. But in cities and industries, mechanical refrigerators were becoming increasingly important not just for food, but for hospitals, laboratories, and factories that required precise cooling. The machines worked, but they were dangerous. The refrigerants in use, ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide, were all hazardous. Ammonia was highly toxic and corrosive, capable of burning the lungs and eyes. Methyl chloride was flammable and had already caused explosions and deaths in households. Sulfur dioxide could suffocate people if it leaked into enclosed spaces. Families lived in fear of the machines that were supposed to make their lives easier. Newspapers occasionally reported tragedies of entire families asphyxiated by leaking refrigerators. Industry leaders knew a safer solution was desperately needed. The perfect refrigerant would be non-toxic, non-flammable, stable, and efficient. It seemed an impossible combination until the challenge landed in the hands of Midgley and his colleagues at General Motors' Frigidaire division. Charles Kettering, ever the mentor and visionary, placed his trust in Midgley once again. Just as he had with the problem of engine knock, Kettering believed Midgley could bring together chemistry and engineering to find a solution. For Midgley, the task was irresistible, a puzzle with immense social value and vast commercial potential. In the laboratory, Midgley approached the problem with the same blend of persistence and creativity that had marked his work on fuels. He scoured the chemical tables, searching for compounds with the right properties. Toxicity eliminated many options. Flammability eliminated others. What remained were the halogenated hydrocarbons, compounds of carbon, fluorine, and chlorine. Through months of experiments, Midgley and his team focused on a group of compounds that had been studied but never widely used: chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. They were chemically stable, non-flammable, and, most importantly, appeared non-toxic in laboratory tests. One compound in particular, dichloro-defluoromethane, soon to be marketed under the trade name Freon 1,2, seemed to offer everything the world wanted. In 1930, General Motors and DuPont announced the invention of Freon with great fanfare. The press hailed it as another miracle of American science, a chemical breakthrough that promised to revolutionize refrigeration. Midgley himself, with characteristic flair, demonstrated its safety by inhaling Freon and exhaling it onto a lit candle, extinguishing the flame without harm to himself. The crowd applauded. The message was clear. Here was a refrigerant that could not burn, could not kill, could not fail. The world embraced it eagerly. Within a few years, refrigerators using Freon became common in households. Air conditioning, once experimental, began to spread in offices, theaters, and eventually homes, transforming the way people lived and worked. Medical storage improved, food preservation extended, and industries thrived. Freon even found use as a propellant in aerosol sprays, from hairspray to insecticides, embedding itself in daily life. Once again, Thomas Midgley Jr. had delivered exactly what society demanded, a practical, elegant solution to a pressing problem. Once again, he was celebrated, honored, and rewarded. And once again, the darker consequences remained unseen. Chlorofluorocarbons were stable, too stable. They did not break down in the lower atmosphere. Instead, they drifted upward, accumulating slowly in the stratosphere. There, decades later, scientists would discover that they destroyed ozone, the thin shield that protected life on Earth from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. What had seemed a harmless household miracle would be revealed as a planetary threat. But in the 1,930 seconds, no one suspected this. For Midgley, Freon was simply another triumph, another testament to his genius. He had given the world safe refrigerators, cool theaters, and comfortable homes. He had once again proven himself a master of chemistry in service of society. And yet, as history would judge, he had also sown the seeds of a second global environmental disaster, one as silent, pervasive, and devastating as the first. The debut of Freon in 1930 was nothing short of spectacular. Newspapers called it the dawn of a new age in refrigeration, and the corporate world wasted no time capitalizing on it. DuPont, with its vast chemical empire, partnered with General Motors to form the Kinetic Chemical Company, tasked with mass-producing the new chlorofluorocarbon compounds. Factories roared to life, and within a few short years, Freon was flowing into refrigerators, air conditioners, and aerosol cans across America. The impact was immediate and profound. What had once been a source of anxiety, the household refrigerator, now became a symbol of safety and modernity. Families no longer worried about toxic leaks of ammonia or methyl chloride. Instead, they embraced gleaming, chrome-trimmed machines that kept milk cold, vegetables crisp, and ice cubes ready at the touch of a hand. For the first time, refrigeration entered the mainstream of domestic life. Freon's success extended far beyond kitchens. Movie theaters installed air conditioning, transforming summer afternoons into comfortable escapes. Office buildings followed, reshaping the experience of work in sweltering cities. Hospitals relied on Freon for medical storage, industries used it in manufacturing processes, and farmers adopted refrigerated transport to bring fresh produce to urban markets. In less than a decade, Freon had become indispensable. The chemical's apparent harmlessness only fueled its spread. Unlike the pungent fumes of ammonia or the suffocating danger of sulfur dioxide, Freon was odorless, colorless, and inert. Demonstrations by Midgley himself, inhaling the gas and using it to snuff out a candle, circulated widely, cementing the image of Freon as a safe wonder. To the public, it seemed as if science had once again tamed a deadly hazard and replaced it with a benign miracle. By the mid-1930 seconds, Freon was also revolutionizing the aerosol industry. Propellants that had once been volatile or unsafe were replaced with chlorofluorocarbons, making possible a dizzying array of consumer products: hairsprays, insecticides, deodorants, cleaning agents. Advertisers promised convenience in a can, powered by the invisible magic of Freon. Few paused to ask where those vapors went once released into the air. For Thomas Midgley Jr., the invention of Freon was another jewel in his crown. He was hailed as the man who had solved two of the great chemical problems of modern life. First, he had quieted the knock of engines. Then he had tamed the dangers of refrigeration. Scientific societies honored him, corporations enriched him, and colleagues marveled at his versatility. He seemed to embody the very spirit of the age, an engineer who could bend nature to human will with elegance and confidence. But the triumph carried the same blind spot as his earlier success with leaded gasoline. The very properties that made Freon so useful, its stability, its resistance to breakdown, its chemical inertness, also made it dangerous in ways no one yet understood. While it appeared harmless in the short term, its molecules lingered in the atmosphere, drifting upward slowly, decade after decade. Once in the stratosphere, they encountered ultraviolet radiation, which split them apart and released chlorine atoms. Those atoms, as later generations of scientists would discover, destroyed ozone molecules with ruthless efficiency. The ozone layer, a thin shield high above Earth, was not even fully understood in Midgley's lifetime. Few suspected that human activity could affect something so distant and invisible, yet the gases he helped unleash would eventually thin that shield, allowing deadly ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface, increasing skin cancers, cataracts, and ecological damage worldwide. None of this was apparent in the 1,930 seconds. For society, Freon was a pure gift. For Midgley, it was another triumph, another chapter in his rising legacy. He could not have known, or perhaps could not bear to imagine, that he had once again invented not only a solution, but a slow-motion catastrophe. By the end of the decade, his reputation was unmatched. He had conquered the automobile's greatest flaw and banished the dangers of refrigeration. He stood as a symbol of American ingenuity, a man who seemed to deliver miracles on demand. But history would remember differently. Where his contemporaries saw genius, posterity would see irony, a man who, in solving the problems of his age, had set into motion two of the greatest environmental crises of the 20th century. By the early 1,940 seconds, Freon had escaped the confines of laboratories and factories and had firmly embedded itself into the fabric of modern life. It cooled kitchens, powered aerosol sprays, and made possible the air-conditioned movie theaters where Americans sought refuge from summer heat. The spread of Freon was not gradual. It was explosive. Within just a decade, it had transformed from a chemical curiosity into a cornerstone of consumer culture. The transformation was cultural as well as technological. Air conditioning, once an experimental luxury, reshaped daily life. Movie theaters became summer sanctuaries, their posters boasting not only of new films, but of icy, cool comfort inside. Department stores followed, advertising shopping as an escape from the swelter. Office buildings, once stifling in July and August, installed Freon-based systems that promised year-round productivity. Even Congress and the White House adopted air conditioning, ensuring that the business of government no longer paused in the heat. For households, the new refrigerators represented modernity itself. Kitchens gleamed with white enamel cabinets and chrome handles, humming quietly thanks to Freon's stability. The days of spoiled food, dangerous leaks, and cumbersome ice deliveries were fading. Housewives wrote letters to companies praising the machines that kept milk safe and lettuce crisp. Manufacturers, emboldened, churned out appliances by the millions. Freon was invisible, odorless, silent, the perfect servant. The aerosol revolution multiplied its reach. Cans of insect spray, hair lacquer, shaving cream, and household cleaners now lined store shelves, each propelled by chlorofluorocarbons. What had once been laborious tasks, killing mosquitoes, setting hair, or applying polish, became effortless with the push of a nozzle. Advertisements promised a spray for every need, powered by chemistry, so safe that no one gave it a second thought. Freon seemed to embody the optimism of the age, stable, efficient, harmless. It was everything the world wanted from modern science. It was as if Thomas Midgley, Jr. had once again bent nature to human will, turning danger into safety, uncertainty into reliability. He was, in the eyes of industry, a man who delivered miracles. But the true miracle was not safety, it was persistence. The very quality that made Freon so reliable in refrigerators and sprays its resistance to chemical reaction also ensured it would not break down once released into the air. Molecule by molecule, every can sprayed, every refrigerator leak, every puff of propellant drifted upward, climbing through the troposphere into the stratosphere. There, far above clouds and weather, the molecules would linger for decades, even centuries. No one at the time suspected what would happen next. The ozone layer, that fragile band of gas that shielded Earth from the sun's ultraviolet rays, was not yet part of public consciousness. Scientists knew of ozone, but its planetary role remained poorly understood. Midgley himself, who demonstrated Freon's harmlessness by inhaling it and exhaling onto a candle, could not have imagined that the gas would one day be blamed for thinning the very shield that made life on Earth possible. Yet the seeds were being sown. Each refrigerator, each spray can, each air-conditioned theater added to the slow accumulation in the stratosphere. The damage was invisible, silent, and delayed. No factory worker fell dead from Freon exposure. No family was poisoned overnight by a refrigerator leak. Unlike leaded gasoline, which claimed victims in refineries and neighborhoods, CFCs killed in slow motion, their effects postponed by decades. This delay was precisely what made the problem so insidious. By the time scientists in the 1,970 seconds discovered the link between CFCs and ozone depletion, billions of tons had already been released. Humanity had been altering the atmosphere for nearly half a century without knowing it. And at the origin of it all was Thomas Midgley, Jr., the same man who had laced the air with lead. In the 1,940 seconds, though, there was no sense of foreboding. Freon was hailed as an unqualified success, a jewel of American industry. Midgley had delivered his second great miracle, and the world embraced it eagerly. Cooling the world seemed to promise comfort, productivity, and prosperity. The warming of an apocalypse was still invisible, waiting silently above. For most of Thomas Midgley Jr.'s lifetime, Freon remained untarnished by controversy. Unlike tetraethyl lead, which almost immediately revealed its dangers in the madness of factory workers and the protests of public health officials, chlorofluorocarbons seemed blameless. They had no odor to warn of danger, no immediate toxicity to leave corpses in their wake, no lurid newspaper headlines about men gone mad. To the public and to industry, Freon was perfection itself. But science has a way of pulling secrets out of silence, and the quiet molecules Midgley helped unleash would not remain hidden forever. By the 1,950 seconds, a handful of atmospheric chemists had begun to take interest in the extraordinary stability of CFCs. These compounds, they realized, were so inert that they could not be broken down by weather or ground-level chemistry. Unlike other industrial pollutants, which decayed or washed away with rain, CFCs lingered. If nothing destroyed them in the lower atmosphere, then where did they go? The unsettling answer was upward. As aviation and atmospheric research expanded during the Cold War, scientists began probing the upper reaches of the atmosphere. They discovered that compounds once thought too small or harmless to matter were in fact accumulating in the stratosphere. There, bombarded by ultraviolet radiation, CFC molecules released chlorine atoms. Each chlorine atom could destroy thousands of ozone molecules before finally being neutralized. The ozone layer, once an obscure concept, came into sharp focus. It was not just a scientific curiosity. It was a shield, absorbing the sun's ultraviolet rays and protecting all living things from their destructive power. Without it, skin cancers would rise, crops would wither, ecosystems would collapse. And now, with each refrigerator leak and aerosol spray, that shield was being chipped away. In the 1,960 seconds, researchers began publishing cautious warnings. They calculated that continued growth of CFC use might thin the ozone layer significantly within a century. The predictions were troubling, but in an age dominated by nuclear fears and space race triumphs, few paid attention. Industry dismissed the concerns as speculative. Government saw no immediate crisis. Freon continued to flow, invisible and profitable. It was not until the 1,970 seconds that the alarm truly sounded. Chemists Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina, working at the University of California, demonstrated with clarity how CFCs were rising into the stratosphere and breaking down ozone. Their research, published in 1974, shocked the scientific community. They warned that continued use of freon and related compounds could devastate the ozone layer, exposing Earth to dangerous levels of ultraviolet radiation. The response was swift and polarized. Environmentalists sounded the alarm, calling freon a hidden menace. Industry, led by DuPont, fought back fiercely, arguing that the evidence was uncertain, that other factors might be at play, that banning CFCs would devastate the economy. The debate mirrored the earlier struggles over leaded gasoline, science versus profit, long-term risk versus short-term convenience. By the 1,980 seconds, the evidence was undeniable. Scientists discovered the ozone hole over Antarctica, a seasonal thinning so severe that it stunned even the most cautious researchers. Photographs of the gaping void above the icy continent became global symbols of ecological peril. Suddenly, the abstract chemistry of CFCs was a matter of life and death. Skin cancers were projected to rise, crops to fail, marine ecosystems to falter. Humanity had unwittingly tampered with the sky itself. By then, of course, Thomas Midgley, Jr. was long dead. He never lived to see the consequences of his second great invention. He never read the reports of ozone depletion, never watched footage of the Antarctic hole, never heard the debates that would culminate in the Montreal Protocol of 1987, the international treaty that phased out CFCs. Yet his fingerprints were unmistakable. Just as he had laced the air with lead, he had helped fill the stratosphere with chemicals that tore holes in Earth's protective veil. Historians later marveled at the irony. Midgley, a man who prided himself on practical genius, had twice delivered precisely what the world demanded, and twice had sown disasters of planetary scale. Few inventors have left such a paradoxical legacy. Celebrated in life, condemned in hindsight, remembered not for what he intended, but for what he unleashed. By the time the world fully recognized the danger, billions of pounds of CFCs had already been released. The ozone layer would take decades, perhaps centuries, to recover. Generations would live with the consequences of a chemical Midgley once inhaled before journalists to prove its harmlessness. The slow recognition was complete. The miracle had become a menace, and Thomas Midgley Jr.'s name, once synonymous with genius, now carried the weight of ecological tragedy. By the early 1,940 seconds, Thomas Midgley Jr. was at the height of his reputation. He had silenced the knock of engines and tamed the dangers of refrigeration. Industry hailed him as a genius who delivered solutions on command. Scientific societies honored him. Corporations rewarded him. To the public, he was the embodiment of American ingenuity. But fate has a way of humbling even the most celebrated. In 1940, Midgley was struck by a cruel illness, polio. The virus, which had haunted families for decades and terrified parents with its summer epidemics, did not spare even the accomplished inventor. Within months, the disease robbed him of his mobility, leaving his legs weakened, his once restless body confined. For a man whose entire identity was built on action, experimenting in laboratories, demonstrating discoveries before journalists, tinkering with machines, the paralysis was devastating. Midgley had always been animated, his mind and hands working in concert, his physical presence commanding. Now he faced the reality of dependence, a condition alien to his nature. Yet even in illness, his inventive spirit did not abandon him. He refused to accept helplessness. With characteristic determination, he began designing devices to make life more bearable. If he could no longer stride across laboratories or bend over engines, then he would engineer solutions to navigate his own home. From his sickbed, he sketched mechanisms of pulleys and ropes, systems that might lift him from bed to chair, contraptions that could give him a measure of independence. To many, it would have been enough simply to endure, to accept care from others. But Midgley was not wired for passivity. The same impulse that had driven him to solve engine knock and refrigeration now drove him to solve his own immobility. Those who visited him in these years found him unchanged in one respect, his optimism. He spoke of recovery, of possibilities, of new experiments that might still be conducted from his chair. He had not lost faith in invention. If anything, his condition seemed to deepen his belief that every problem, no matter how cruel, could be conquered with ingenuity. But the truth was harsher. Polio had left him frail, his body vulnerable. The war years pressed on, the world consumed by conflict, but Midgley's battles were fought in quieter rooms against weakness, against dependency, against the humiliations of paralysis. For a man who once commanded laboratories and corporations, it was a cruel irony. And yet, his inventive defiance would persist to the very end. Out of necessity, he built the machine that would ultimately lead to his death. Even as paralysis tightened its grip on Thomas Midgley, Jr., his mind refused to yield. The same curiosity that had driven him from childhood, that had carried him through the laboratories of Cornell and the research halls of General Motors, still sparked with restless energy. His body might have been weakened by polio, but his imagination remained fierce. Bedridden for long stretches, he refused to see himself as a passive patient. He filled notebooks with sketches and diagrams, ropes and pulleys, traced out in pencil, the calculations of counterweights and leverage scrawled beside them. He was determined to regain autonomy, even if by mechanical proxy. Where others would have resigned themselves to dependence, Midgley saw a new engineering problem, a puzzle as worthy of solving as engine knock or refrigeration. Soon, in the room where he spent his days, a strange contraption took form. A network of ropes, pulleys, and harnesses hung above his bed. With it, Midgley could hoist himself upright, transfer from mattress to chair, and adjust his position without assistance. Visitors marveled at the ingenuity of it. To them, it was the invention of a man who could not stop inventing, a mechanical extension of his will to control his fate. In a way, the device embodied his entire career. It was practical, clever, and effective in the short term. It solved an immediate need with elegance. But like his earlier triumphs, it carried hidden risks. The ropes and pulleys were unforgiving. A slip could prove disastrous. The very machine that gave him independence also introduced new dangers. Yet Midgley did not dwell on those possibilities. His mind was too busy, too committed to action. He continued to discuss projects with colleagues, to correspond with scientific societies, to stay engaged with the world of invention. He remained a figure of respect, still honored for his past achievements, still consulted for his insights. To the outside world, he was a testament to resilience, a scientist who refused to be broken. Privately, though, there must have been moments of despair. For a man who had once stood before audiences, dramatically inhaling Freon or washing his hands in leaded gasoline, the loss of mobility must have felt like a betrayal. His body had once been an instrument of persuasion, his performances as much a part of his inventions as the chemicals themselves. Now, confined to bed, he had only his words, his diagrams, and his machines of necessity. And still he invented, because he knew no other way to live. In those final years, as the world outside plunged into the turmoil of global war, Midgley's battle was intensely personal. But in every rope he strung, in every pulley he calibrated, in every note he scribbled, one truth remained. The man who had altered the air of the earth could not stop trying to alter his own immediate world. His last invention, a contraption born of desperation, would, in time, become the instrument of his undoing. On a quiet November day in 1944, Thomas Midgley, Jr. was found dead in his home. The cause was not polio, nor some slow illness eating away at his body, but the very machine he had designed to grant himself independence. The ropes and pulleys that once lifted him from bed, that had symbolized his refusal to submit to helplessness, had become a snare. They tangled around his neck and strangled him. The irony was staggering. Here was a man who had engineered solutions to the world's problems, who had bent chemistry and mechanics to his will, undone by his own device. It was as if fate itself had chosen to deliver a final, cruel commentary on his life, that the genius who created miracles also unleashed disasters, that the tools he built to solve problems often carried dangers he did not foresee. Newspapers reported the death with somber brevity. To the public, Midgley was still a respected inventor, the man who had given the world smooth-running engines and safe refrigeration. They did not yet know the full extent of the harm his inventions had sown. To his colleagues and family, his death was tragic, sudden, almost unthinkable. They mourned him as a man who had lived with vigor, who had refused to surrender to illness, and whose restless mind had never ceased to invent. But to history, the manner of his death became emblematic. It seemed a metaphor too sharp to ignore. Midgley's contraption was meant to give him freedom, but instead it brought him destruction. So, too, had his larger inventions promised progress, only to deliver catastrophe. The rope that tightened around his throat became, in the eyes of later generations, a symbol of the unintended consequences that defined his legacy. He was 55 years old when he died, an age at which many inventors are still in their prime, still producing work, still shaping the world. But Midgley's shaping of the world was already complete, and its effects would continue long after his death. The air carried his mark, the atmosphere itself bore his fingerprints. His life ended in quiet tragedy, but his inventions would echo through centuries. In the end, Midgley was neither felled by disease alone, nor defeated by helplessness. He was undone by the same quality that had defined him, an unrelenting belief that every problem could be engineered away. The problem was not his ingenuity, but his blindness to consequences. And so, in a small room filled with ropes and pulleys, the story of Thomas Midgley, Jr. closed with a dark and bitter irony. When Thomas Midgley, Jr. died in 1944, the world mourned him as a man of invention, a brilliant problem solver who had shaped the modern age. Newspapers praised his contributions. Scientific societies remembered his ingenuity. Colleagues spoke warmly of his determination and charm. He was laid to rest with honor, his name etched into the annals of American industry. But history is a relentless judge, and the verdict on Midgley would not be delivered in his lifetime. It would emerge slowly, piece by piece, as the true consequences of his inventions unfolded. Within a few decades, the toll of leaded gasoline became undeniable. Studies revealed that children in cities had higher levels of lead in their blood than those in rural areas. Doctors confirmed that the metal impaired brain development, reduced intelligence, and increased behavioral problems. Economists later calculated that trillions of dollars in potential productivity had been lost. Crime researchers link the rise of violent crime in the mid-20th century, at least in part, to neurological damage from lead exposure. Midgley's miracle additive was no longer celebrated. It was condemned as one of the greatest public health disasters in history. The same shift occurred with Freon. For decades, it had cooled homes, preserved food, and propelled sprays without incident. But in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, as the ozone hole widened above Antarctica, scientists traced the cause back to chlorofluorocarbons, the compounds Midgley had proudly introduced to the world. The realization was chilling. His second great invention had altered the chemistry of the atmosphere itself, threatening every living thing on Earth. The irony was so sharp, so cruel, that historians could not resist framing his life as a parable. Here was a man of remarkable ingenuity, whose career embodied the optimism of industrial America. Yet his two most celebrated achievements, the twin pillars of his fame, had unleashed disasters of planetary scale. He had been praised for solutions, but remembered for catastrophes. One historian, J.R. McNeill, delivered the most damning epitaph. Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. It was not praise. It was condemnation. And yet, the story was not one of malice. Midgley was no villain twirling his mustache, plotting destruction. He was, in many ways, a victim of his time, a man who believed, as so many did in the early 20th century, that progress was inherently good, that invention carried no shadow, that consequences could be ignored in the face of immediate need. He was brilliant, but blind, creative, but careless of the long arc of his creations. The judgment of history, then, is not simple. Midgley is remembered as both genius and cautionary tale. His name is invoked in environmental debates as a symbol of unintended consequences, of technological hubris, of humanity's power to alter the earth without realizing it. He stands as a reminder that intelligence without foresight can be as dangerous as ignorance. In classrooms, he is studied not for his equations or patents, but for the ethical questions his career raises. What responsibilities do inventors have to future generations? How should society weigh short-term gain against long-term risk? Can progress ever be safe if its dangers are invisible? Thomas Midgley Jr. solved problems that defined his era, but he left behind problems that define ours. His inventions reshaped the 20th century, but his legacy shapes the questions of the 21st. The judgment of history is clear. His genius cannot be denied, nor can the catastrophes it unleashed. The life of Thomas Midgley Jr. is a prism through which we can examine one of the greatest paradoxes of modern history, the unintended consequences of invention. His story reminds us that progress often comes with shadows, that even the most well-meaning solutions can spiral into disasters when foresight is absent. At the heart of this paradox is the very nature of technological innovation. In the early 20th century, America worshipped invention. The airplane had conquered the skies, electricity had conquered the night, the automobile had conquered distance. In that atmosphere of optimism, invention was seen as a pure good, a sign of human mastery over nature. Few paused to ask whether every victory carried hidden costs. Midgley embodied that ethos. His genius was practical, immediate, and elegant. He did not pursue abstract theories. He solved pressing problems. Engines knocked, he silenced them. Refrigerants killed families. He replaced them. Each time, he delivered exactly what society demanded. Each time, his solutions were celebrated as miracles. And each time, catastrophe followed. The lead that silenced engines poisoned generations, seeping into bloodstreams, crippling minds, and leaving scars on entire societies. The CFCs that cooled homes and theaters ascended invisibly into the stratosphere, shredding the ozone layer that shielded life from deadly radiation. Midgley did not intend these outcomes. He likely did not imagine them, but intention is not the measure of consequence. The tragedy of Midgley's legacy lies in the gap between what he solved and what he caused. He approached problems as an engineer, defined, immediate, measurable, but the world does not end at the boundaries of an engine or a refrigerator. Chemistry released into one corner of life spills into all others. Molecules do not obey corporate contracts or industrial patents. They drift, they accumulate, they transform. The broader systems, ecological, biological, planetary, were not part of his calculations, and so his solutions became seeds of disaster. The lesson is not limited to Midgley. History is filled with similar stories. The pesticide DDT saved crops and fought malaria, but devastated bird populations. Fossil fuels powered modern civilization, but now drive climate change. Plastics revolutionized daily life, but now choke oceans and rivers. Again and again, humanity solves the problem before it and creates another, more insidious one just beyond sight. Midgley's life is perhaps the purest embodiment of this pattern. Few inventors in history have delivered so much short-term benefit with so much long-term harm. His brilliance was genuine, his creativity undeniable, but brilliance without foresight, creativity without responsibility, is dangerous. This does not mean invention must cease. It means invention must change. The unintended consequences of Midgley's work remind us that every discovery exists not only in the lab, but in the world, in air, in water, in soil, in blood. The task of science is not merely to solve immediate problems, but to anticipate future ones, to weigh benefits against risks, to imagine not just how a technology serves today, but how it may haunt tomorrow. Midgley did not live to see the reckoning with lead or with freon. He died believing, perhaps, that he had given the world nothing but gifts. But history sees more clearly. His story is not a condemnation of invention itself, but a warning. Progress without foresight is peril. In his ropes and pulleys, in his gasoline and refrigerants, in his triumphs and in his tragedies, Thomas Midgley, Jr. leaves us a single enduring lesson that genius can solve problems brilliantly and still be blind to the problems it creates. The shadow of Thomas Midgley, Jr. stretches far beyond his lifetime, casting its influence over the way modern science and policy are practiced. Though he died in 1944, his inventions continued shaping the planet for decades, forcing scientists, governments, and societies to confront the uncomfortable truth that innovation is never without consequence. The first echo came in the public health movement against leaded gasoline. By the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, studies began to confirm what critics had long suspected. Children in urban areas carried dangerously high levels of lead in their blood. Neurological impairments, reduced IQ, learning disabilities, and behavioral disorders were tied to lead exposure. Scientists like Claire Patterson, the geochemist who measured lead isotopes to date the age of the Earth, discovered with horror that human blood and even polar ice were saturated with industrial lead from gasoline. His work was instrumental in revealing the global scope of contamination. The fight to remove lead from fuel was fierce. Oil companies and their allies resisted, just as they had in the 1,920 seconds, arguing that the evidence was incomplete, that alternatives were costly, that the economy depended on ethyl. But science, bolstered by relentless data, prevailed. In the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, regulations began phasing out leaded gasoline in the United States and eventually worldwide. By the turn of the 21st century, most nations had banned it. Blood lead levels in children dropped dramatically, and entire societies witnessed improvements in public health and intelligence scores. The lesson was clear. Industry's reassurances cannot outweigh long-term scientific evidence. The second echo was the battle over chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. When scientists Rowland and Molina exposed their role in ozone depletion in 1974, the parallels to the lead crisis were unmistakable. Once again, a chemical hailed as safe and indispensable was revealed to carry planetary risks. Once again, corporations denied the dangers. Once again, the conflict between profit and precaution raged. But this time, the world responded more quickly. In 1987, nations signed the Montreal Protocol, an unprecedented global agreement to phase out CFCs and protect the ozone layer. It was a triumph of international cooperation, hailed by environmentalists as proof that humanity could act collectively to confront ecological threats. The treaty remains one of the most successful environmental agreements in history. Decades later, the ozone layer began to show signs of recovery, a fragile healing process that continues today. Both of these battles against lead and against CFCs were shaped by the ghost of Midgley. His inventions forced scientists to reconsider the ethics of innovation. They raised pressing questions. Should safety be proven before new chemicals enter the market, rather than after harm is revealed? Should inventors be held responsible not just for their intentions but for their consequences? Should governments place public health above corporate profit when the two conflict? Modern science echoes these questions in every debate over technology. When pesticides are developed, when artificial intelligence is deployed, when genetic engineering advances, the name of Thomas Midgley, Jr. lurks in the background as a cautionary tale. His story reminds us that solutions without foresight can create problems greater than those they solved. Perhaps the most enduring echo is philosophical. Midgley's career shows that genius alone is not enough. What is required is wisdom, humility, and responsibility. The great scientists and engineers of today are not judged solely by their brilliance, but by their ability to anticipate risks and protect future generations. The legacy of Midgley presses upon them, urging caution, foresight, and ethical reflection. The echoes are sobering but instructive. They remind us that innovation is not the end of a problem, but the beginning of a chain of consequences. Each invention enters not just the marketplace, but the environment, not just the present, but the future. The sound of those echoes lead in the blood. Chlorine in the sky continues to reverberate, warning us to listen before it is too late. It is tempting to remember Thomas Midgley, Jr. only through the lens of his inventions, the poisoned skies of leaded gasoline, the thinning ozone from chlorofluorocarbons. Yet behind those catastrophic legacies was a human being, one far more complex than the caricature of a villain or the abstraction of a man who harmed the earth. To understand his story fully, we must look not only at what he did, but at who he was. By most accounts, Midgley was warm, affable, and charismatic. He had a gift for communication, a talent for turning complex chemistry into simple demonstrations that dazzled audiences. When he inhaled freon and snuffed out a candle with his exhaled breath, he wasn't just showing science, he was performing, embodying the optimism of an age that believed every problem had a solution. He smiled easily, enjoyed conversation, and inspired loyalty among colleagues. He was not a recluse or an eccentric genius cut off from the world. He was a family man, married to Carrie Reynolds, and together they had children. Friends described him as generous, humorous, and deeply social. He enjoyed sports, particularly baseball, and carried with him an easy charm that made him popular in both laboratories and boardrooms. He thrived in groups, and his career flourished under the mentorship of Charles Kettering, with whom he shared not only scientific pursuits, but also a friendship built on mutual respect. Nor was he motivated by malice or greed alone. By all indications, Midgley believed in the value of his work. He genuinely thought tetraethyl lead was a manageable solution to engine knock. He believed Freon was a gift to households. His willingness to expose himself to dangerous chemicals during public demonstrations suggests not just a salesman's performance, but a man convinced of his own claims. If he harbored doubts, he suppressed them, perhaps even from himself. And yet there was another side to him, a streak of hubris, a confidence so strong it shaded into blindness. Midgley trusted his ingenuity, trusted the corporations that supported him, and trusted the spirit of progress that defined his era. He did not stop to ask what might lie beyond the immediate problem. He did not imagine consequences measured not in months or years, but in generations. He had the brilliance to solve puzzles, but not the patience to imagine the world those solutions would inhabit. Was he a villain? History says no, at least not in the deliberate sense. He was no saboteur, no reckless destroyer intent on harm. Was he a victim? Perhaps partly of a cultural moment that prized progress over caution, of corporations that valued profit over prudence, of a society that mistook invention for salvation. But to leave it there would absolve him of responsibility. The truth lies in the tension between these two extremes. Thomas Midgley, Jr. was both a man of his time and a man responsible for his choices. He embodied the optimism of early industrial America, and he embodied its blindness. His charisma made him trusted, his ingenuity made him celebrated, but his lack of foresight made him dangerous. He did not mean to poison the world, but he did. He did not mean to threaten the atmosphere, but he did. What remains is the paradox of his character: genial yet catastrophic, well-intentioned yet devastating, brilliant yet blind. He was not the devil some portray, nor the saint his contemporaries imagined. He was something far more human, a man whose genius outran his wisdom, whose triumphs became tragedies, and whose life is now a warning etched into history. The story of Thomas Midgley, Jr. does not end neatly with his death in 1944, strangled by his own contraption of ropes and pulleys. His life left threads that continue to weave through history, shaping the air we breathe, the policies we craft, and the questions we ask about progress itself. His legacy is not buried in his grave. It lingers in the atmosphere, in the blood of generations, in the lessons we struggle to learn. Midgley's tale is not one of malice, but of blindness, the blindness of a man, a society, and an era intoxicated by invention. He exemplified the faith that every problem could be solved by chemistry, that progress was an unalloyed good, that the future would bend easily to human ingenuity. And in the short term, he was right. He delivered smoother engines and safer refrigerators. He gave the world convenience, comfort, and speed. But the long term told a different story. His solutions carried poisons into the lungs of children and ripped holes in the sky. They forced later generations to clean up messes they did not create, to pay costs they did not choose. They left us with the sobering truth that genius without foresight can be as destructive as ignorance. What, then, is the lesson of Thomas Midgley, Jr.? It is not that invention is dangerous, nor that progress should be feared. It is that invention without responsibility is perilous. It is that science cannot serve only the present. It must serve the future. It is that every discovery carries consequences beyond the laboratory, beyond the marketplace, beyond the lifetime of its inventor. Today, as we stand on the edge of new frontiers, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate-altering technologies, Midgley's ghost hovers near. His story warns us not to mistake brilliance for wisdom, not to confuse solutions with salvation. It urges us to ask not only can we, but also should we, and what comes after. The ending of his story is open because it is not only his, it belongs to us. Every invention we embrace, every technology we unleash, carries with it the possibility of unforeseen harm. The air may no longer carry lead from gasoline, and the ozone layer may be healing from CFCs, but new Midgleys walk among us, armed with tools more powerful than ever. The question is whether we have learned enough to guide them, to temper their genius with foresight, their ambition with humility. Thomas Midgley Jr. remains a paradox, not a monster, not a hero, but a mirror. In him, we see the brilliance of human creativity and the folly of human short-sightedness. In him, we see both the triumph of invention and the tragedy of its unintended cost. His story does not end with his death. It continues in every decision we make about the future we are building. The ropes that ended his life were not just the strands of a machine, they were metaphors for the entanglements of progress itself, threads of ingenuity and danger, hope and hubris, solution and catastrophe. We are still caught in them. Whether we learn to untangle ourselves, that is the ending still unwritten.